Then I'd like to introduce our main speaker this evening is Clancy I, whose home group is the Pacific Group in Los Angeles. Thank you, Clancy.
My name is Clancy Imslin, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm very glad to be here tonight. I really enjoyed the 10-minute, 15-minute, and 16-minute speakers. I got to quit on time, but they don't have to, yeah. Anyway, love is the answer. I know we have a number of people here who are not alcoholics, who are friends of alcoholics, and who are non-alcoholic. And I was asked tonight to just give a little picture of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'll tell my story tomorrow night, the same old dreary story. But Alcoholics Anonymous, especially to the new folks and those who are non-alcoholic, it really is a staggering thing. I know sometimes the non-alcoholics, you may wonder, what do you make such a big deal about AA for? There's a lot of people who don't drink. And that's true. But there seems to have been types of people as far back as there's been written history who have had problems with drinking. Wherever alcohol has been, there's been some group, small portion of that group, who were resistant to ever being able to stop. And up to this day, we seem to have types of alcoholics. There's a type of alcoholic who seems to be an alcoholic by any way you measure them. Something happens that maybe they lose their job or their family or someone dies, and they quit, and they never drink again. And I have an uncle like that. And they go to treatment centers, and treatment centers withdraw them from alcohol, and they quit, and they never drink again. Now there's another type of alcoholic who seems to be an alcoholic by any way you measure them. They drink too much, get in trouble, and something happens that threatens their security, and they quit. But they always eventually drink again and again and again. And they come out of treatment centers with tears of sincerity rolling down their cheeks, and they quit. But they always drink again and again and again. And these are the type of people who have baffled everyone for 4,000 years of written history. They've been helped. At one time, they're possessed by devils. They'd be put to death. Every generation has tried to help these people. Finally, they just gave up over trying to help them almost for hundreds of years, sometimes, and then try it again, and on, just absolutely baffling. And these are the types of alcoholics that have engendered so much interest in the social community, and yet there's never been an answer to it. In my lifetime, I'm old, but I'm not 4,000 years old, but in my lifetime, when I was a little boy, there still was no answer for people like this. And this whole movement is just a series of funny little coincidences that have fell into place. In 1930, there was a family in New York who had a big industry. They had a son who was a very able man, and he was going to take over the company. He was in his mid-30s. He was a vestryman of the Presbyterian Church. But his problem was he suffered from nerves. He seemed to get nervous. And when he got nervous, sometimes he drank too much. And his family knew this was something to do with psychology. So they determined to send him to the doctor. And they found the best doctor in the world and contacted him and said, our son is in his mid-30s. He's a very able man, but he gets nervous and drinks too much. Would you please help him? And they contacted Dr. Freud. And Dr. Freud in Austria, I'm happy to say, rejected their offer. That was the first break we ever got. Otherwise, we'd be sitting here tonight drunk and saying, but I dreamed I was sober. So they went to his associate, Dr. Jung, and Dr. Jung took him in. So two guys took him to Switzerland and put him in the Dr. Jung's clinic, and Dr. Jung worked with him every day for a year and broke through his defenses and got to the inner man and got him set away and redressed in his emotions and said, Roland, I think you've got it together now. You understand the problem. You can go home. I think you'll be all right. So Roland came home, and he stopped in Paris with some friends of his family, and they were so pleased they toasted his new life. and he had a little drink of wine to toast it. And a couple days later, he was face down, drunk again in his own vomit. Everybody was just absolutely, how could this be? He was just cured. So they took him back to Dr. Jung, and Dr. Jung refused to take him back in the hospital, which again was a very blessed thing for us, so we didn't know it. And they said, why won't you take him back? He didn't mean to be bad. He just accidentally got nervous again. And he said, no, it's my fault. I misdiagnosed his case. I thought certain that I was able to redress his emotional imbalance. But I see now that he is what is known as a chronic alcoholic. And unfortunately, there is no known treatment for that condition in the world today at any cost. That's 1931, not very long ago. And Roland, of course, was taken aback. He said, what does this mean, doctor? He said, what it means, Roland, is that you must keep yourself confined voluntarily or involuntarily as long as you live. Otherwise, you almost certainly will intermittently drink to excess until you die or go mad. And Roland said, is there any other way at all? And the doctor said, well, there are a few cases in the literature where there's been an involuntary major cycle change. They call it some sort of a spiritual experience, but I've never seen one. I would imagine your chances of being hit by lightning are better than that change happening to you. And Roland was demolished by this, and he came home. He didn't stop in Paris for a toast this time. He got the ship. And on that ship, apparently coming from New York to from Paris to New York, he did something all of us have to do sooner or later, although we don't know it. He surrendered to the fact that he was helpless, hopeless. And he came home and he cast about, as I say, he'd been an elder in the Presbyterian church. He'd been a vestryman, they called him. And at that time, there was a little movement afoot, kind of an interesting thing. In 1912, a minister in Pennsylvania felt that Christianity was kind of getting out of hand. There was no good Christians much. They didn't have the drive that the old Christians had. So he formed an organization called the First Century Christian Association to get Christians to have the zeal that they had in the first century, where they were willing to be crucified upside down and burned for their belief. Not very many people joined. But he came to England and shopped it around, and oddly enough, some of the people at Oxford were taken by it, with some variations. Nobody wanted to be crucified upside down. Oh, a couple did, but they wouldn't let him. But they got all involved and enthused with it. And the First Century Christianization gradually became known as the Oxford Group. And the Oxford Group got to be kind of strong. And to get back to he brought it back to America then, and it really took hold in a lot of places. It became a spiritual thing. It was designed for, as it worked out, it happens in many cities where better types of society would get together in people's homes and discuss spiritual values and how they could enhance their spiritual values. And it was really very big in the early 30s. That was the cream time of it all. And Roland saw this and thought, I'll go there and see what happens. He wrote later, I wanted to stay sober as long as I could so my parents would have a pleasant memory of me when I died drunk. And some years later, when he died drunk, his parents had a pleasant memory of him. He'd been sober a while. But he stayed sober, the zeal and enthusiasm of this Oxford group that he's in, and he felt good. And eventually his parents said, Roland, you've done such a wonderful job. We never thought you could do this well. Why don't you go back to our country home up in Vermont and relax and enjoy life a little bit? And he said, great idea. He's been working again, took a little vacation up to Vermont. And the odd thing is, if you're new, if he'd have gone a month later, we wouldn't be here tonight. But when he got there, one of his friends came up and said, gee, Roland, I hear you're on the wagon, good. He said, but one of our friends, Ebby, is really still drinking bad, and now he's in deep trouble. Would you talk to him? I said, sure I will. He said, sure I will. So he talked to him. He said, Ebby, I'm in this spiritual movement called the Oxford Group, and you want to... Oh, I said, I don't want to hear that religious crap. That doesn't help me. I said, okay. So a week or two later, guy came back and said, gosh, you've got to help us to get rolling. Ebby drove his car drunk into a house. And he's going to go to the penitentiary because he's on such probation. He said, my father is the judge, and he won't listen to me. But he may listen to you because he knows your father. So because Roland happened to be in town, he went to the court and said, yes, I know Ebby, and I had that same problem, but I've stopped now through the Oxford Group. And if you'll release him to my custody, I'll take him to New York and put him in the Oxford Group. And the judge says, Roland, I wouldn't do this for anyone else, but I know your father and I know your history, and I'm going to do this just because it's you. But keep him out of Vermont. If he comes back here, he's going to go to the penitentiary. So Roland took him back to New York, put him in a mission, lower Broadway, and got him involved in the Oxford Group. And he wasn't terribly crazed about it, but I mean, it was better than being in the Vermont penitentiary. And he went along. And one of the things in the Oxford Group, I guess that we got from them, is that after a few months of spiritual growth, you were supposed to go out and testify to somebody what you'd found. And Roland said, well, Ebby, time to go out and testify. And Ebby said, I don't want to. And Roland said, you want to go back to Vermont to the penitentiary? He said, no, I believe I'll testify. So he thought, who can I test? It's so embarrassing that, I mean, I don't mind staying out of the penitentiary, but to go out and testify, ugh. And then he happened to remember another friend of his who he knew had come to New York, a bigger mooch than he was, had been some kind of a big shot, was now a loser, just a loser living off his wife, a mooch drunk. He thought, I could testify to him. He won't even remember it. So he made special appointment to find this mooch named Bill Wilson, who's living in Brooklyn drunk. And he made arrangements to go over and see him, to testify. And in our book, Bill gives his version of it. You know, he came to the door and this man was there clean and neat. And he said, hi, Ebby. And he said, you look so good. He said, yes, I found religion. And that turned Bill off, of course. But I heard Ebby talk at the International Convention in 1960. He had a little more detail than that. He came in and they sat at the table, and he talked to Bill about this spiritual thing he'd found, and Bill just drank as fast as he could. That's really wonderful, Ebby. I'm really proud. And Ebby left, and he was a little upset with this. So what Bill does not mention in our book, but I'll guarantee you happened. 3 days later, he brought back the Oxford Group closer. I've come to work with you, Mr. Wilson. I want to tell you about the Oxford Group. Brrr, you know. And Bill Wilson responded, as I hoped any of us would, got drunker than hell. And a few days later, he sobered up again. And he said, I'm going to go over and see Ebby into the mission. And he had a few drinks on the way over and got drunk again. By the time he got to the mission, Ebby was gone. But he stopped and gave a sermon anyway and staggered on down the street and wound up that night in the hospital, back in the hospital. Same old drunk hospital he wound up in again and again. And the doctor called his wife and said, Mrs. Wilson, I have some bad news for you. I think your husband doesn't have many of these left in him. This may be his last one. You may prepare yourself. You may not have him for a mate much longer. And she was thunderstruck, and she called up Ebby, because Bill had told her about Ebby, at the mission, and could you go up and talk to him? And Ebby went up there, brought a couple guys from the Oxford Group, and he said, Bill, you got to find some kind of a power greater than yourself, a God that you can believe in, and turn your life over to him. And Bill said, I don't want to hear that. That's nonsense. Okay, and they went home. In the middle of the night, this drunken loser woke up, and for some reason he just shouted out, if there's a God, show yourself. And all of a sudden, he said later, the room filled with light. And he thought he heard a wind blowing, and he knew he was going insane. My God, I'm going insane. But he felt better. All of a sudden, the room dimmed down. And later, he told the doctor about it. He said, Doctor, I don't know what it was, but something happened. And the doctor said, I don't know what it was, Bill. But whatever it was, you better hang on to it, because you look different. And Bill came out of that hospital, sober, and he went to the Oxford group. You say, well, what's all this crap about Ebby and Dr. Jung and all that stuff? Why would you need that? Because most of the people, whoever had, of the very few who had a spiritual experience, they associated with churches, and they'd go off to church work. But he somehow associated with the Oxford group, getting people to stop drinking, although that isn't their purpose at all. So he went to the Oxford group, and he started picking up drunks off the streets and taking them to the Oxford group meetings, which made him no friends at all. Because these are very nice people sitting there and bringing some lousy, stinking steep drunk. And I believe you're vomiting on my shoes, sir. And he would take them home sometimes. They had no place to stay. And he just tried to help people. And again, he just, at the end of 6 months, he got up one morning, and the guy he had brought home the night before had gotten up early and stolen some stuff out of the kitchen to sell for wine, apparently. And he looked at his wife, this girl Lois, who'd been a pert society girl, now as a result of being with him so long, was down to being a drab, prematurely gray, working as a counter girl in a cheap department store. And she put on her sweater with a patch on the sleeve, and it all just struck him. What a charade this has been. I thought I was able to help, so I can't help it. He said, Lois, I'm all done with that crap. I thought I could help people, and I could. I'm going to get a job somewhere, it's going to be different. I'm not going to do this anymore. I've worked with people every day, and not one person has stayed sober. And right there, your life and mine hung by a thread so thin you can't hardly believe it. I had lunch with her many years ago in Connecticut at the convention. I said, Lois, how did you ever think of that answer you gave? Because she gave him an answer that saved our lives, although she didn't know it. She said, I don't know, it seems so obvious to me. When he said, not one person has stayed sober, she said, you did. And he said, oh yeah. That's why old timers don't have much hair in front. You just go through life. So we kept going, and he finally got a little job. Somebody gave him a job to go out to Akron, Ohio. Going to get him stock together in this company. I'm going to make him president of the company. They said, Bill, don't screw this up. You screw this up, you'll never work around here again. So he went out to Akron, and the thing screwed up. It wasn't his fault, but it blew up in his face. His last big chance, his chance to finally make it. And he stood in the hotel lobby in Akron, the day before Mother's Day in 1935. He reached in his pocket, and he had a $10 bill, and he could either now pay off the hotel or take a train home. And over here was a door. I stood there in that lobby, in that same spot, some years ago, kind of a romanticist, tried to envision what it must have been like. And there's a door with a little cocktail sign over it. And he had the thought, which many of us would have, I suppose, I'll just have a drink or two and think what to do. And he started towards that. And you and I almost died then. But he happened to see some telephones on the wall. And he remembered he'd promised those goof Oxford group people that he will call somebody in the Oxford group. He hadn't done it yet all the time he'd been in Akron, but he better do it now. So he called the first minister had some ministers and phone numbers over the phones, as they do in small-town hotels. And he called the first guy, and he said, my name is Bill Wilson. I'm a rum hound from New York. I got to talk to somebody in the Oxford group. And the voice said, I don't know what your problem is, sir, but I'm trying to write a sermon. Tomorrow's church. Please don't bother me again. And hung up. And he called the next number, and there's no answer. And he called the next number, and the man said, I don't know anything about the Oxford group, and hung up. And I don't know about you, but me, I think I would say, I did what I said I'd do. I'll just have a drink or two and ease it off. Oh, it just makes you shiver. But he looked down the list, and he saw a funny name. He thought he'd call him Reverend Walter Tunk. Never want to miss a chance to call Reverend Tunk, I'll tell you. So he called up Reverend Tunk. And Reverend Tunk says, funny you should call. I have a woman in my congregation who's doctor that has a bad drinking problem. He's in the Oxford group too, but he can't stay sober. He says, just admit his problem. Let me see what I can get a hold of. He said, wait in that phone booth. And so Bill waited, and he called this lady. Thank God she was home, because if he had to wait long, he wouldn't have waited. And he called back and said, yes, she's going to call you. It's your number now. And she called him at the phone booth. And he said, I'm a rumhorn from New York, and I'm a member of the Oxford group, and I would like to talk to someone who's in the Oxford group who has a drinking problem, perhaps. She said, my doctor has just had that problem. Wait in the phone booth, and I'll call their homes. And thank God they were home. And he talked to the doctor's wife, and the doctor's wife said, well, you can't talk to the doctor because he's drunk and laying on the floor here. But we will talk to this man tomorrow. So there's a woman called Bill Wilson back, and they made plans to meet the next day at her mansion in Akron. She was the heiress to the rubber company, big rubber company fortune. And the next day, Bill Wilson out there in a bus, and the doctor's son drove he and his wife and their daughter out there. He was a good friend of mine, Smitty. He died a couple of years ago. But I always enjoyed his talking about driving his dad out there. He was 16, and the father was hungover and sick. Says to him, he knows he's going to get another sermon about his damn drinking from this idiot from New York. He said, I'll go and listen to this guy for 10 minutes because it's Mother's Day and I want to be good for him, but I don't want to sit to some damn sermon. So they went out there. Not a very auspicious start. And finally, these guys bandied a few words and went off to a room together and stayed in there 4 hours. And they came out, and the doctor said, my God, I can't believe it, Ann. That's the first man that ever seems to understand how I feel and why I drink. And he said to Bill, Bill, could you stay with us a while instead of going right back to New York? And we could talk about some of these things that's bothering me. And Bill thought, let's see. I don't have train fare. Yes, I can stay. So he stayed with him a couple of weeks, and they talked about spiritual matters and deep understandings and how the spiritual life can keep you sober. And the doctor blossomed, and we felt so good. He said, last year I went to the American Medical Association meeting in Atlantic City, and I got drunk, and they all ridiculed me. And I'm going to go there this year and show them what I'm like. And you stay here with my wife and kids, and I'll be back over the weekend. So off he went to Atlantic City. Monday morning, they got a call. It was the doctor's nurse. She says, Mrs. Smith, I'm so sorry. But the train came in today from Atlantic City, and the doctor was so drunk they had to carry him off the train. And he put him on the platform, and the station agent called me up, and I went down there and got a cab driver to get him. And he's on the floor of his office now, and I know he's trying so hard, but apparently he just can't stay sober. So they went down and got the doctor and brought him home and put him to bed. And again, this meeting was almost not going to be held, I'll tell you. And after a couple of days, he's kind of come to. He said, oh, my God, I feel so bad. I feel so bad. What day is it? He says, it's Wednesday, Bob. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. I've got to do a cancer surgery today. And look at my hand. I can't do a cancer surgery. My God, if I blow this, they'll maybe take my license. What will I do? So they got him up and bathed him and dressed him. And his new friend Bill got him some booze to make his hand stop shaking. And they took him down to the hospital about 11 o'clock. Said, now be sure to come back. Oh, yeah, well. And he went in there, and they went home to wait for him. And 2 o'clock he didn't come, and 3 o'clock he didn't come, and 4 o'clock he didn't come, and 5 o'clock he did. And they knew exactly where he was, drunk again. And about 6 o'clock the door opened, and here he came in, sober, bright-eyed, alert. They said, Bob, where the hell you been? He said, you know, in this Oxford group, they want you to make amends for your wrongs. I would never do that because I didn't think a doctor should. But after I did that operation today, I thought, that's what I should do. And I've been all day long going around Akron making amends to people I've hurt. And that was wonderful. And that was June 10th, 1935. And the moment he set down that drink Bill bought him and picked up his operating equipment, that's the birth moment of AA. But what changed? Here's what changed. They realized sitting around talking about spirituality is not what had kept Bill sober. It was working with others. And Bob found a drunken lawyer up in the hospital in Akron. And they talked to his wife. He was a lawyer who'd moved from Kentucky to get away from drinking. Of course, he didn't get away from drinking, just got away from Kentucky. And he was up there, and she said, I'll see if he'll talk to you. So she went and says, Bill, his name was Bill too, there's two men who want to talk to you about my drinking. And he was adamant about it. He said, I don't want to talk to you anymore. People don't want my drinking. I'm sick of it. Sick of your sermons. Leave me alone. But she was a strong woman. So when they went in to see him, they talked to him for about an hour. And they left, and he called his wife and said, I don't know how to tell you this, but these guys never talked to me about my drinking once. They talked about their drinking and how they felt. I never had anybody explain that. Show me what I'm like. I can't believe it. And he became the third one in the chain. Then they worked with a couple of people who they had a very religious approach. Find God, that's the answer. And they couldn't get anybody sober for a while. And they got a couple other guys sober. They finally got one young guy sober, a guy named Ernie. That's kind of funny. Not funny, but it's odd. Because he was a young guy. He fell in love with Dr. Bob's daughter and brought our organization, we didn't have an organization yet, but brought our preceding organization its first relationship. I know of no word that sends a shudder down a sponsor's spine worse than that word. I want to talk to you about my new relationship. What you need a machine on your phone that just says, uh-huh, and put the phone. And they say things like, oh, I know I thought the last one was the right one, but this one, I'll tell you, today when I saw her walking out of detox, I just knew. And when these guys call you up, you hate to tell them the facts of life. This is just childish infatuation. This is not love. This is just childish lust. But no, I swear it's the right. And you want to tell them the truth. The guy says, we were having lunch, and our fingers touched. And I saw a spark. There actually was a spark. And you hate to tell them the facts. You're like, well, in the one chance in 300 million that your relationship lasts, and that you finally get married to her maybe 3 years from now, you're going to be sitting at your little kitchen table having breakfast and your little toddlers playing on the front lawn. It isn't going to be like this. You're going to reach for the salt, your fingers are going to touch, and you're going to say, give me the goddamn salt. But anyway, Ernie fell in love with Dr. Bob's daughter, and they got married, which sounds very nice, doesn't it? My youngest daughter married a guy that I sponsor. It sounds very lovable. But I'll tell you, I was against the marriage, but I was outvoted by the ladies of our family. But if you want a textbook description of mixed emotions, it's watching your daughter go down the aisle to marry a man whose fifth step you've heard. You can't really say anything, but you can give little clues. Let me know if he ever brings a sheep home, honey. And Ernie, I don't want to get out too much on this, but Ernie, since he's a newlywed now, he shouldn't have to be running around with these guys chasing drunks, so they let him stay home with his wife where he should be, and so they felt bad when he got drunk and died. And turned her against AA for the next 50 years. But eventually Bill went back to New York, and they got a little group going there. And in 1938, they thought, what we should really do, they were still members of the Oxford group. What we should really do is build a series of hospitals where we can help drinkers. But how the hell can we build a series of hospitals? We've got no money. We'll write a book about our experiences. And so Bill Wilson wrote the book we read from tonight. And he checked it out based on the experiences he's watching. And he didn't have a title for it. They're going to call it The Way Out. And somebody went to the copyright department and found out there's 18 books already called The Way Out. So some of the A's in Cleveland, Ohio, had named their group Alcoholics Anonymous when they broke away from the Oxford group. And they broke away from the Oxford group because they belonged to the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church didn't want them to go to Protestant services. That's simple. So the book became Alcoholics Anonymous, and the movement became Alcoholics Anonymous. And they issued this book. Bill wrote it in 1938, came out in 1939, never, didn't sell at all. They couldn't build a box of matches out of the sales of this book. But at least it was a good book. And they kept going. They struggled. They didn't have very many people, but they had a few. I'll tell you this story. In the book, the first foreword said, "We are a group of over 100 men and women who have found sobriety." Later on, Bill wrote, "There really was only 79, but I thought 100 sounded better." And we all understand that. That's thinking. And in 1940, of course, you know the story. In our book, they got some money from from the Rockefellers and so on. But the interesting thing, in late 1940, the Saturday Evening Post, a big magazine, had a specialist in uncovering corruption. He had just finished a great series on the Philadelphia labor movement and what a corrupt, rotten bunch they were. His next assignment is get in there and find out about that Alcoholics Anonymous. Let's get the stuff on them. So he went and studied Alcoholics Anonymous. He had them now. And much to his surprise and chagrin, they were just what they said they were. Nobody was stealing anything. Nobody's doing anything. People were trying to help people, just on and on. So he wrote an article in 1941, appeared in one of the March issues of the Saturday Evening Post, about Alcoholics Anonymous. And it took the country by storm. Because they estimate maybe 8 or 9 or 10% of alcoholics, of drinkers are alcoholics, most of our type. And so a lot of homes had it. They just flooded New York with mail, and all over the country, little groups started all over the place. Just wonderful, just hundreds and thousands of people going to meetings. And they went through the steps, and by 1942, they kind of peaked. Big bunch. 1943, Bill Wilson started getting letters saying our group's died, our group is fighting, our group is having problems. One by one, the groups are dying. By 1944, the groups were winding up little by little. It's getting down, and Bill felt helpless to arrest it. He thought, if I could just get some unity. So he started this magazine called The Grapevine, at that time a tabloid size, but that didn't do much. What the hell is that going to do? And in 1945, as he watched these things come in, a doctor in North Carolina sent an article into the Bill of the Grapevine and said, here's an interesting thing. Have you ever heard about it? And he'd written the story of a group in Baltimore who had, just like AA, just 100 years before. Nobody had ever heard of it. But 6 guys got together in a bar in Baltimore. One had just gotten out of jail, and he was complaining. He said, that chaplain there says he knows how I feel. He doesn't know how I feel. Nobody knows how I feel. You guys do. Yeah, we all know, but we're all terrible drunks. What can we do? Maybe we can help each other stay sober. How could that be? We'll try it. So they drew up a little constitution. They elected officers, 5 officers and 1 member. That's about right. Who do you identify with? And everybody laughed at them. You drunken boobs. You can't even keep yourself sober. But they somehow stayed sober. And they got a few people to join them. And some guy came down from Philadelphia and was so impressed he went back and started a little group in Philadelphia. And a group started in Washington. And they started a little group in Boston. And they got a little group going to New York. And after a year, they had several hundred members of this group. They named themselves after George Washington, our first president. They called themselves the Washingtonians. By the end of and just remember, there was no telephones, no radio, no nothing. Every one of those guys had to be 1-to-1. And at the end of the second year, they had chapters in almost every state. And they still were treated as kind of eccentric beings, however. So they sent out a letter all over to all the members they could find and said, we've taken Washington's birthday, February 22nd, is our anniversary. On that night, have somebody who's kind of an opinion maker in the community, maybe a younger guy, but has some opinion. And so all over the country, on August 22nd, or February 22nd, 1842, they had people come in. In Springfield, Illinois, they had a young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, and he came in and gave, if you ever read a book on Lincoln's speeches, you'll find one to the Washingtonians. And a lot of it was just blah, but some of it was really good. He says, I know you people. I know you all. And you have a thirst I can't understand. I don't have that thirst. But I know one to another, you can help one another. And it was a great thing. And it really took off. Because there was no radio or, as I hate, television. Most entertainment in those days was done by mass meetings where they'd bring in a speaker who would speak on wonderful subjects, and they'd go to it. And so they got a couple of these speakers in the Washingtonians, and they turned hundreds and thousands of people onto the sobriety. By 1845, they had about 100,000 sober drunkards. Who'd ever heard of such a thing? Drunkards like us. And what they did then, they did something that sounds right, because people in AA think it's right today. Gosh, if we're able to help drunkards, we should be able to help all kinds of people. We should be able to help narcotics addicts who aren't drunkards, not heroin and cocaine like today, but laudanum and opium. We should get involved in stamping out the sale of alcohol. That'd get rid of alcoholism. We should get involved in politics and everybody got involved in all sorts of things that just gave up all this working together. And by 1848, the Washingtonians were extinct. In nearly every instance, they all died drunk. I had a book home written by one of the few survivors in 1861. He said, it's hard to tell what happened. We were doing so well, and then people got too busy and too involved, and didn't have time to help anybody more. And Bill Wilson read this. He'd never heard of the Washingtonians. He thought, my God, that's what's happening to AA. And so he took all the experience he had and read his letters, all the problems he's having, and read the Washingtonians, and sat down in a last gasp effort to save Alcoholics Anonymous, or us, although he didn't know it was us. He wrote the 12 traditions. We always think they just come out with a book and the steps and all that stuff. They were written long after. They were written based on thousands of people like you and I getting drunk. And he wrote them in the long form. This form is the kind of an abbreviated form, but sometimes you get a chance in the back of the book across from the short form is the long form, and it really fleshes them out. But he introduced them one by one in their new magazine called The Grapevine. And unfortunately, Alcoholics Anonymous had the same problem then that it has now. It was full of alcoholics. And most of the people didn't want to, we don't want any rules. We're here to find love. I don't hear this crap about rules. And so Bill Wilson used to ride around his motorcycle, go to meetings, try to explain it to him. And it got so bad, in the archives in New York, there's a letter saying, Dear Bill, please come and talk at the 3rd anniversary of our meeting. But if you're going to talk about the traditions, don't come. We don't want to hear it. Tough. And near the end of the 1940s, there were some people accepting it, but some weren't, and AA really depended on it. And so he and Dr. Bob, now Dr. Bob and Bill got along very well. Their followers didn't. In Akron, they were still kind of the Washingtonians or the Oxford movement, and they had the 4 absolutes on the wall, which kind of religious absolutes, and they felt they were more spiritual. And the people in New York were a bunch of highbinders, just all would run around. And the people in New York didn't want anything to do with those religious pukes in Akron. So Bill and Dr. Bob told their followers, let's have one meeting somewhere where everybody can see how everybody's doing and understand we're all on the same page. And so the people in Akron said, well, we'll go to a meeting, but we won't go to New York. And the people in New York, not to be outdone in spirituality, said, we'll go to a meeting, we won't go to Akron. So Bill and Dr. Bob got together and had a Solomon-like decision. Cleveland, All right. So the 4th of July weekend, 1950, the first large group of alcoholics of our type in ever recent history met in Cleveland. And I have the tapes of that weekend. The tapes are of terrible quality, but they're very interesting. They had speakers who weren't alcoholics because they're still trying to overcome this feeling of nobody understands them. They had the warden of San Quentin Penitentiary talking about how much AA helped them. On the last day, Bill and Dr. Bob spoke. Now, Dr. Bob at that time was dying of cancer. They said, "You probably don't want to speak, Bob." He said, "I've got to speak. I'm 15 years sober. Next to Bill, that's the longest sobriety in the world." And so Bill gave his talk, and then Dr. Bob had son on one hand and a friend on the other arm, took this long, tall, gaunt, dying man to the podium, and he gave a little talk which has echoed down in history of AA. Just the first part was not much to it. He said, "I want to welcome you all to Cleveland, and I hope you'll go back and tell the boys and girls in your groups that we're all doing the same thing. We get out of AA what we put into it." He went on to say, "As I look over this vast crowd, I'm glad that some small thing I did a number of years ago helped bring this about. So I want to apologize for my health. I've been in bed most of the last few months. My health has returned." And it's just small talk, practically. But then he said there was just two or three things I want to call to your attention. And then he gave a talk, and that little part of his talk became what many people feel to be the Gettysburg Address of Alcoholics Anonymous. Short and absolutely succinct and to the point, and as appropriate tonight as it was then. He said, "First, let us remember to keep our program simple. Let's not louse it all up with Freudian complexes, which may be of interest to the scientific mind, but has nothing to do with our work here. Our work here, when reduced to the last, consists of love and service. And we all know what love is, and we all know what service is. Secondly," he said, "let us guard that erring member, the tongue, and try to use it with kindness and understanding." And there isn't a person in this room who doesn't understand what he was talking about there. Because when they are going our way, we're all love. Oh, life is wonderful. But let somebody hurt our feelings or say something bad about us or threaten us. And finally he said, "None of us would be here today if someone hadn't taken the time to perhaps take us to a few meetings, to explain things to us, to give us a pat on the back when we needed it. Let us never reach that stage of smug complacency when we are too busy to help our fellow alcoholic who still suffers." He said, "Thank you," sat down, was dead shortly thereafter. Later on, at the same convention, they had six young guys, each take 2 long forms of the traditions and explain them. Just, these are not rules. These are exciting things to help our society. There's no AA police. We can't, that was a mistake, I thought. I always thought, old-timers always feel there should maybe be AA police, just a little. And now you've heard our 10-minute speaker tell you bad stories about how mean I am to newcomers. In my hometown, although unjustly, I am known as a dictator-type sponsor. So I tell people things. And people say, "You're just a dictator. You're taking advantage of these people." But what they never realize, you can only be a dictator as long as you have the full approval of the dictatee. All he has to say is, "Screw you," and the dictatorship is over. I think it would be nice if we had police could come at night and say, "Did you say screw you to your sponsor? Come with us to the camp for a few weeks." But they have the traditions, and they voted him in. I'll tell you, this is kind of off the record. I hope you won't tell anybody that I said this. But on that tape, Bill Wilson still wasn't sure that they were going to approve it. I got done reading, he said, "You've all heard the new 12 traditions. Seeing no objections, we accept them." And they saved our bacon, I'll tell you. And AA's grown. And now it's grown quite a bit. And it's, a little more time, I could tell you a little bit more, but it's grown to over 2 million people, apparently, 134 countries. And it's really the most remarkable thing in the world. And the big problem for us is to remember to be grateful that we were born in the only window in human history where there's a place where we could go and get help, where people understood, made up of people like ourselves. It's an amazing thing. Over the last few years, I've been to these exotic places to talk, Cape Town and Greenland and Iceland and Oslo and Bali last summer and Indonesia and all over South Central America. You'd think you'd hear exotic AA in these places, but except for the accents, you hear the same things you hear in your own group. Those emotions are always the same. But I think my case is different. I'm not sure I'm an alcoholic. I think I have other problems. And people saying, we understand. Here's how it worked for me. And just watching that identification take place. Successful AA is always based on identification. It's more than a coincidence, I think, that the only 2 successful treatments of alcoholism in history of our type have been the 2 organizations that had one drunkard talking to another drunkard. Because the nature of the problem is this: the great problem in the treatment of our type of alcoholic has always been, deep within me, I hear them, but I know my case is different. You don't understand. And that's what kills people like us. You think, well, not many people die anymore. Yeah, they do. In America, where there's probably an AA meeting in every town that has a stoplight. And in Los Angeles alone, in our meeting list, we have over 3,000 meetings a week. My home group, the Pacific Group, meets on Wednesday night. Some of you have been there. Over 1,000 people every Wednesday night in that meeting. And they're all enthusiastic. So you no longer have to have a spiritual experience. You just have to show up at the meetings. In America, where there's more sobriety than any place in the world, the National Institute of Health in 2004, I guess it was, looked as they could at alcoholics of our type in the United States and said, as far as they could tell, something over 90% still die drunk as a direct result of drinking. It's got to be worse here. It's got to be worse here. Now, why would that be? Because people have to surrender to the fact. And people never hear from another drunk apparently talking to them, or never willing to give them the chance to do it. In the nature of my work today, I watch people die from alcoholism regularly. And it just makes me crazy, because I know there's an answer. Then I have to remember, why did I slip in and out of AA for 10 years and went from being a high-bottom drunk to being a skid row bum with my teeth kicked out? I don't like pain. But the last day I drank, I would have bet my life. Nothing in this crappy program can help me. But I found someone who got through my defenses and got me to do something I had never done before. Instead of just reading and knowing Alcoholics Anonymous, he got me to do it. It offended me, but it changed my life. Because that's the point of it all here, to get him to do it. But we are so fortunate to have been born in this one window. And the biggest problem we have is to remember to be grateful for it. We all say, oh, I'm a grateful alcoholic. People slide in and out all the time. Yeah, I'd like to go to AA, but I got other important things to do. I can't be doing that, you know. Because Alcoholics Anonymous, this wonderful thing, based on many thousands of people like you and me who died doing it other ways, there's the same thing tonight in this city. It's the same thing in this hall as it was June 10th, 1935. You say, how can that be? Well, they didn't have any book. They had no meetings. They had no backup. But what they had is the same thing you and I have. They had one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic to help him reduce his feelings of difference at least enough so that he would begin to take actions he did not yet believe in. And that's the same story tonight in every place that Alcoholics Anonymous meets. We had a very, very picturesque history, a lot that I didn't get around to. But I'll tell you one thing, be glad you're here. Thank God tonight before you go to sleep. Thank God I was born where there's people who seem to understand what the hell is wrong with my goofy head, and there's a chance for me to live. And when you get, I think you'll sleep a lot better. Thank you.